In today's new episode of Missing, we speak with Elin Lantz Lesser of the new podcast, America's Crime Lab. And Lance, we speak about several different cases with Elin, and of course, America's Crime Lab is referring to Othram Labs, which is pretty familiar to our audience and certainly to us. What do you think of this conversation?
Well, anytime we have the opportunity to get somebody on who represents Othram, we grab that opportunity. And Elin is such a great representative of Othram and somebody who has experienced what it's like to work firsthand with David and Kristen Middleman. And that is such a cool thing to hear that perspective, because we've had them on the show before and we've had dialogues, when we're not recording, just about how much good that this company does. They go to CrimeCon, they represent so well at CrimeCon, and we get a wonderful inside glimpse into how fast and how effective their technology has been moving in order to solve these cold cases. And it's just a pleasure to have Elin on.
It is. And the new podcast is great. It really takes the stories that they've been moving forward in the crime space and tries to tell them in, the fashion that is really consumable. And I think the challenge is there's a lot of science behind this stuff. So Elin comes in and makes the story much more consumable for listeners. So you can subscribe to America's Crime Lab right now on your favorite podcatcher. And also check out what Othram is doing on their website at othram.com. That's OTHRAM.com.
All right, we're going to break real quick for commercial, and we will be back with Elin Lantz, with a TZ, Lesser.
Okay, please follow us on social media at Missing CSM. Welcome to the podcast, Elin Lantz Lesser. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me on.
It's very rare that we have someone on who has a name close to mine, but you spell yours differently, so we're going to allow that this time around. I do like I might change my spelling. I might change it to the TZ at the end.
Yeah, maybe you should. It's a little edgy, I guess, but then people get confused by it. So probably not, actually.
Well, I like introducing confusion into conversations when I first meet people. But let's avoid any confusion here. Do you mind introducing yourself and telling a little bit about yourself to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So like they mentioned, my name is Elin, and I am currently the host of America's Crime Lab, a podcast that follows a lot of just riveting, extreme cases that occur in the U.S. And we follow cases that are mostly solved by a lab down in Texas, just outside of Houston. And they basically have this cutting edge DNA technology that allows investigators to basically get way more information out of the DNA. Instead of, with the old technology, getting around 20 markers in what the typical testing used to be, they're getting between 100,000 and 1 million markers. So way more information that allows them to basically track down people more using what's called forensic genetic genealogy. It sounds sciencey and overwhelming, but I think in our show we kind of simplify it a bit so it's consumable. But basically, they're using it in a way where they are solving the coldest of cold cases that are 40, 60 years old. And it's really changing the way crimes are being solved. Luckily, I bet a lot of your listeners actually might be a little bit familiar with some of the cases or with the technology, because probably they're more informed than the average person. But I think it's incredible to follow these stories and listen to how these cases are being solved in a new way. I guess, though, what you asked, though, was about me, and then I went off about Othram, this lab in Texas. My background is actually kind of unusual. I I used to work in psychology. I got my PhD in clinical psychology, gave therapy for years, did research, and then shifted to journalism and media creation. And so I think that does kind of inform how I do interviews and go about this project. I really enjoy talking to detectives and families of victims and just going deep, diving right in. And since then, I've also worked on other podcasts. I've produced and co-hosted The Turning, which is another podcast focused on kind of extreme and cult-like groups. So I've always been interested in true crime. I'm somebody who's up late at night, like diving deep into crimes and that kind of thing. So I was really excited to be a part of this project.
Well, it's great you said that you're talking about DNA and you're talking about a lab in Texas. A lot of people know the name Othram, and I think they would say that that's the lab now. I don't think that it has risen above like the standard and the expectations that all of us here have just been used to for the past several years, for decades really. And then they came out of the blue, and the way that they've rapidly increased the production and the results has been astounding. So when you say like a lot of this can sound sciencey, I feel like with their track record and just the fact that you can have the creators, the owners, the CEO, like, you know, you can have them on shows and they'll talk to the listener and they'll bring it down to this level where it's like, okay, I understand it. It's different when you have those results. So it is sciencey, yeah, but with the results that back it up, I think everyone just gets it. And some things might go over our heads, but hey, if you're saying like this person's case was solved and this family has answers, and we have new technology where you can plug in just these details and you can get a whole database of information, we'll take sciencey. We'll take a little bit of like, like, I don't quite get it, but hey, you know, I'm seeing like an arrest happen, or I'm seeing a family find the identity, the whereabouts or whatever for their loved one. So it's really amazing work. It's like an honor to even talk to anybody associated to them.
Oh, wow. Well, I have to say, I mean, it's been an honor being able to talk with them and interview them. I have to admit, sometimes I'm even a little intimidated when I interview people at Othram, because they are, like you said, they're cream of the crop. They really know their stuff. And I have even learned a lot about the science and everything, and how really what they've done to a big part of what makes their technology unique is their process. So it's not just about running the DNA. As we know, often when you test DNA, it's consumed. So you want to be really careful not to test DNA unless you're fairly certain you can get a result. And a lot of labs will not necessarily have the best process for evaluating, can we test this DNA? Do we have enough DNA? Is it not too degraded? Because that's a thing you often see in crime scenes is, you know, in a typical like genealogy test where you swab your mouth and you send it off to figure out your ancestors, that's like a clean swipe of your saliva in your mouth. Whereas at a crime scene, obviously, the DNA has maybe been sitting out for days or months or years. It's, you know, exposed to the elements, to rain, snow, animals, plants. The DNA can be mixed up with the victim. And so it's much harder to take that DNA and get a successful result. And so part of what Othram is really groundbreaking in doing is also being able to evaluate, can we test this DNA? And then even if they don't quite have the technology to test it yet, they'll create like quasi DNA to test and make sure they can do it, and then test the real stuff. And so basically they are getting results from really degraded, really even old DNA in a way that I think is truly groundbreaking.
Very cool. And when's do you remember the first time you ever heard of Othram and what they were doing?
Well, I had heard about the technology in general with the Golden State Killer. I don't know exactly when I became familiar with Othram itself. Basically how this project came to be was it truly was a team effort. Like, I do not take credit here. But basically both the companies I'm working with, the production companies Kaleidoscope and Rococo Punch, work together with Othram to say, hey, we need a podcast. We need to get the word out about this technology, but also tell the riveting stories of these cases that are being solved on in an ongoing way. And so they were like, hey, let's make this podcast. I think people want to hear these stories and hear directly from Othram. And so then that team I had worked with previously on other shows. And so they said, Elin, we think you'd be perfect to work on this. So that's when I really became familiar with Othram, was once the project was kind of underway. And obviously I had heard about this type of technology being used and how groundbreaking it was. The fact that this technology was being used to track down and get serial killers that had been just out and about in the public for years and years, potentially. Like the Gilgo Beach serial killer was caught using this technology. There was even, there's a movie made, I think, with the actress who plays Holly in The Office before they even determined, I don't know if you've seen that movie, who the Gilgo Beach serial killer was. And it's like these big cases are just being solved. You know, the Idaho College student murder case that's being solved by Othram. So it's, I feel so lucky to be able to talk to the people and really hear what's the lab like? Like, what is life there like, and how are they solving these cases?
So you came from a slightly different background with your education, but you said that you were a true crime consumer and fan, and you've made like a transition, or you've made maybe a bit of a compromise of how to use both of those experiences and those passions. And I'm wondering, like, was there ever a moment where you graduated from true crime consumer to being really like emotionally invested into some of these cases? Because you did use the word extreme when we started off. And I'm wondering, like, if there ever was a time where you thought, this is kind of, I guess there is, right? This is beyond true crime. This is beyond just consuming. This is actually like being a productive part of a solution. Was there like a moment there that you can recognize?
Yeah. I mean, when you put it that way, I'm almost like, this is a big moment. The way you phrased that, even in this interview, I know that sounds kind of corny, but like, I've never heard it phrased that way, of like, you are almost like an active participant in this. But it's true, because I think that is the goal of this podcast, is to get information out about this technology so that people are aware of it, because part of why it's not disseminated to all the cases that it could be is because the awareness is not there. And plenty of detectives across the country, once they hear about this, can use these resources. So you're right. I definitely think that, as far as, I think I've gotten a lot more personally invested as I've interviewed people in the cases. I will say there was a transition there for me personally, where, you know, it's one thing, I think, to watch all the documentaries, to watch the YouTube videos, listen to the podcasts, but it's another to speak to detectives who have been haunted by these cases, potentially for years, to speak with family members, or I don't know, just it becomes that much more personal. And it's something that does, you know, I take it home with me at night, where I'm thinking through these cases, I think, in a whole new personal way. That I don't know, it just makes me take them that much more seriously. I mean, I know that all listeners, I think part of why people are drawn to true crime is the humanity of it. You know, I don't think it's because necessarily of the drama even, or the horror. I mean, there's an element of that, but I think it's just, what is more human than people being faced with such horrific events? And there's something relatable about that, even if you haven't experienced a crime exactly like that. And I think doing this podcast has brought me that much closer to facing those horrors in a way that has touched me, definitely, and has changed how I feel about these cases.
Yeah, I don't know if there are people out there who feel this way, because if you're listening to this show, you obviously are into this topic. But
totally,
I feel like there might be some people out there who will think to themselves, you just said, you know, I have to like come to terms with and be emotionally invested in these horrors. And in so many words, it's what you said, that you have to be emotionally invested in these horrors. And it's like, a lot of people might be thinking, why would you ever do that to yourself? What do you think is the importance of opening yourself up to that? I mean, I personally know why it's important to me, but why is it important to you to open yourself up to these horrors?
I I think there is something so important about creating space for victims to hear voices of families or to have those stories out there in the world. I know the work you guys do is a huge part of that, of getting stories out there. And it sounds so basic, but I think there is a beauty in having a person's story heard and not avoiding it, because I think as humans, we also like to avoid tragedy and kind of brush it under the rug. And yes, talking about it could also help solve future cases, absolutely. But I think there is a beauty simply in giving the space and validation for what happened. Like, that's why we study history. That's why there's just something inherently important about that to me, which is why I think I did sort of pivot careers and I wanted to be a part of helping other people lift other people's stories up. I'm curious, what do you have an answer to that? What is it for you? Why do you pursue the horrors?
Ad sales. I'm just kidding. No, that's the reason. I mean, we started doing this because we were really interested in the community that was really passionate about a particular young woman who disappeared in New Hampshire. And we were just fascinated by that online community that was contributing in both a positive and a really destructive way. And the more we dug into that community, the more we realized that people started talking to us about the actual disappearance. And we got closer to the people who are connected to this person, friends and family, and I mean, even people that, old boyfriends and things like that. Yeah. And then we got introduced to other podcasters who are doing this, and the sense of community and the sense that enough voices doing enough responsible work can actually make a difference is really amazing. We were asked to be on the board of a nonprofit by the father of a missing person that helps families investigate their missing loved one. So when you can actually see like the result of something, it's really satisfying. So yeah, that's and money, and lots of money that comes with it.
I also think the medium of podcasting translates that energy, that caring energy, better than other mediums. And I can't really explain why, or maybe I can a little bit. I mean, I think it's a personal experience. That's probably what I would point to first. But it is different from other mediums in that way. You can give survivors and victims longer than TV. And it definitely connects in a way where if you're passionate, the listener feels it. And if you're not passionate, they can tell too. So you are doing a great job, you and your team, on your podcast, America's Crime Lab. I'm curious about like how you structured the show, and was science and not making it too sciencey like part of that approach?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we really wanted to almost push toward a more narrative type of show, as opposed to like a let's tell you about the science type of show. We really let the stories lead and then interweave the science. So and we try to kind of integrate some suspense and looking at different suspects and trying to let the listener kind of piece together what they think might have happened before we give it away. So that's kind of, I think, what makes our show kind of fun, is that we are focused on the science. I think what's cool is people who listen will learn a lot about the science, but it's not too science forward, I guess I'll say, where, we learn about the people. We hear from victims' families. We hear from detectives being confused, not knowing where to turn next, feeling overwhelmed by a lack of leads or too many leads. And we step through those stories. And I think what's cool too is that as you hear each of these stories, you start to hear themes about how the technology is being used. How it's interesting that quite often this technology provides really wild, unexpected answers in ways that a lot of other true crime stories don't often have. Statistically, so often it's the family member or the spouse or the significant other. But a lot of these cases, I mean, that can happen in these cases, but also often it's somebody out of left field, not even on the suspect list, because they're using this DNA technology. And maybe that was why the cases were so hard to solve in the first place. And so it's like we've got some extra suspenseful, unexpected endings to these stories too.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
And I saw that you kicked off the podcast with sort of a mini series on the Carla Walker case from Fort Worth, Texas. Can you tell us about this case and what happened to Carla?
Yeah, so in 1974, so a number of years ago, in Fort Worth, Texas, Carla Walker disappeared. She was a 17-year-old girl, full of energy, really fiery personality, a little bit silly. She wanted to be a veterinarian, and would even like paint her dog's fingernails pink. So it was, she's just kind of, she's a really spunky girl, and she's dating the quarterback of the football team. And on the night of the Valentine's Day dance, her boyfriend Rodney picks her up. They go to the dance, and at the end of the night, they're in the parking lot of a bowling alley, and doing what teenagers do. They're in the car kissing, and suddenly, according to Rodney, what Rodney told police, the car door suddenly opens. There's a man or multiple people there with a gun. Rodney thinks he was shot and goes unconscious. When he wakes up, Carla is gone. She's been abducted, according to Rodney. He drives back to her family's house, the Walker home, and says, Carla's gone, They alert police. Now, the funny thing is, apparently it was probably like an hour and a half before Rodney got home to the house. Even the blood on his face had kind of coagulated, and he actually wasn't shot. It appeared he was kind of like hit on the head. And so a lot of question marks start coming around Rodney pretty quickly. But initially, they start this massive search. 3 days later, they find Carla's body in a cattle culvert, which is kind of like a bridge type of thing in the middle of a field. Underneath that, they find Carla's body, and she has been sexually assaulted and murdered. And interestingly, also, they find that her promise ring that Rodney, her boyfriend, had given her was kind of strewn. It had been taken off her body and was strewn nearby. So again, more questions around Rodney. But they did find a gun magazine in the bowling alley where Rodney had said she'd been abducted. So they also have that piece of evidence. They look into the type of gun and question people. So they're looking at a lot of different people for the crime. But eventually, they just don't have enough evidence. They can't figure out who it is. So the case goes cold. And Carla's family is absolutely devastated. Her brother Jim talked about what it was like. He had stayed up to welcome Carla back home at the end of the night, and he stayed in that house and waited for her or someone who knew something to return. Well, I guess they found her body, so not her, but later on, but waited hoping to get some kind of lead. And he just lived with the question mark forever. Could it have been someone in my own community? Eventually, as time passes, of course, DNA comes onto the scene. And so they do an initial test. They found semen on a bra strap that had been saved from them that, mind you, had been saved in paper bags because that's how they stored things back then, because DNA, wasn't a thing in 1974. And so they test it, and they run the DNA profile through CODIS, the national database, and there are no hits. So it's a huge bummer. They've consumed the DNA and they don't have any hits. So they're really bummed about it. But then soon Othram comes onto the scene, and they actually reach out because there was a special about the Carla Walker case on TV, and the co-founders of Othram, David and Kristen Middleman, reach out and say, hey, we think we might be able to help with this case. We have this new technology. And they basically get the last tiniest bit of DNA that was found on Carla's dress. Now, mind you, this DNA is like 4 nanograms, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, which is an infinitesimally small amount, just like a handful of cells. And it's also mixed with other DNA. And it's, it had been sitting out for 3 days in the cattle culvert. Who knows how useful it can be? But Othram's confident they can test it. And so this is like their last Hail Mary, because this is their last DNA that they have of potentially the perpetrator. And so they test it and they find a name, Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. They realize he was actually on this list of, I think, 80-something, maybe 84 people that were potential suspects. And it was because he owned the gun that had been left in the parking lot matched with. Now, they had questioned him back in the day, and he had even taken a polygraph test to say that his gun had been stolen. He didn't know where it was. And as we know, of course, polygraph tests aren't as reliable as previously thought. And so they go back and they question him again. He agrees to give a new sample or a sample of DNA. At first, he says, oh, I think I already gave a sample of DNA back then. But his wife is there and she says, oh, no, honey, there wasn't DNA back then in this way. You didn't give it. So he gives it. And similarly, his alibi had been that he was driving his wife around that night because she didn't drive. But she said again, she corrected him. She said, oh, no, honey, silly I was out of town that weekend. And so they test his DNA. It confirms it is indeed him. So that begins then a whole questioning. They take him in for questioning. At first, he's denying it. Eventually, he does confess to the murder. And what's interesting about this is that he confesses to it and he starts to describe some of the details. But then he also describes some of the details incorrectly. Like, I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, but something about like what she was wearing. And oddly, that matched what another victim who died in similar circumstances had been wearing. And so the detectives begin to realize this guy might have committed this type of crime more than once. He might have murdered multiple girls or young women. And so we might have a serial killer on our hands, a serial killer that has not been caught, who has been living in the community for 46 years, is a trusted father of 2. And they ask him, do you think maybe you're confusing different people that you did this to? And he says, I don't think so. So in any case, that there probably is more to investigate with some of those cases, but they were able to find this guy, and he admitted, okay, yes, I did have the gun. I hid it in this room that I had built onto my house in the ceiling panel. You lift it up and they find the gun wrapped in a towel. So there's another piece of evidence. And that's something I almost want to highlight about this technology. I think people hear about it and they might be afraid, oh, like, does this mean that you can just leave your DNA at a crime scene and then they'll say you did it, even though you're totally innocent? Really, what this technology is being used for is it's used as a lead. It's not saying this person committed the crime. It's saying this might be a really good person to investigate. And then you look at their alibi, you look at other evidence, and you talk to them and see if they admit to it and know details about the case to confirm that they indeed committed the crime. And so I think that's important to realize too. And I don't know what you're interested in, or I could go into a lot more, but even when he goes to trial, initially, he, after confessing, tries to plead not guilty, because this DNA technology is very new. Will it be admissible in court? It's amazing what seems so clear outside of trial can look very different in the reality of a trial. But then eventually he does decide to plead guilty. and is convicted. Obviously, I'm kind of telling you, I'm giving away what happens in the case, but I think it's still worth listening to our 4-part series on Carla Walker because there is so much more that goes into it, including someone comes forward earlier on and like confesses to having committed the crime and had nothing to do with it. He wasn't even on a suspect list and was jailed, and even there was a grand jury and he was indicted. So it's a great example of how this DNA technology can cut through the crap and give you a real answer. And also an important piece of this too is that it exculpated Rodney, Carla's boyfriend. There was so much skepticism swirling around him. He moved from Fort Worth, Texas up to Alaska to start a whole new life because of all the doubt and all the pain associated with this case. And he had lost someone so close to him as well. I mean, I think they had that promise ring signified they were going to eventually get married and they really cared about each other. So it was a huge loss for him then to be questioned in this way. So this technology changed so many lives. It changed the lives of Jim, Carla's brother. It changed the lives of the community, of Rodney, the boyfriend, and it obviously put a very dangerous person away.
You kind of answered my question as you described the results of the investigation, but maybe there's more to this.
Mm-hmm.
With a sample so small and DNA being so foreign to some people, some investigators, or even the media, how they're going to cover this, with a sample being so small, so old, and collected in a situation that could easily be argued that it has been tampered with or that it's been sort of polluted, how does Othram convince an investigator or an investigative team to say, no, this can lead to that arrest? I'm not saying it's going to lead to the conviction, because we know like how much it actually takes to arrest a person and put those charges on someone. So I guess like you did kind of answer it a little bit when you said that it's not meant to solve the case. It's just meant to say you might have a lead. So what's that communication like? How do you convince somebody who's already like skeptical of DNA in general? And then say, well, it's 47 years old. It was found in like, what was it? A cattle area, like a cattle,
Yeah.
It's like a measurement that you can't even conceive how small it is. How do you convince an investigative team that this is important?
I think it was very vulnerable and scary for them. I think they were kind of comforted by the confidence that David and Kristen Middleman at Othram showed them. They said, we can solve this. We can do this testing. We have the process. We take that process very seriously in a way that arguably other labs might not. And I think it was just that communication that allowed the investigative team to say, okay, we are taking this risk. This is our last shot. We are trusting you with it. Also, an interesting part of your question is it's one thing also to test it, but then to have it trusted in court, especially because I believe that Carla Walker's case was the first with this particular DNA technology being used in a court of law, at least when they were preparing for the case. And so that's also a huge concern. But I think one comforting thought about it is quite often they will use the new technology along with the old DNA technology. So yeah, with any new technology, you want to feel confident that you can believe it. And first of all, Othram, I know, is doing a lot of studies to test this new technology and to have it peer reviewed and go through all those typical scientific hoops. But then in addition, I mean, they need to have precedents in court, of course. And what I haven't gotten into yet, which I'm guessing a lot of your listeners know a little bit about this, but part of what this technology does is because it gives you between 100,000 and 1 million markers instead of just the 20 in the typical old type of technology, you're able to spit out those data, put them in a genealogy website that has consented to forensic investigations. And you're able to map out a family tree. That's what forensic genetic genealogy is it's almost like detective work unto itself. But you're looking down through a family tree, how many matches of these markers fit in with these other matches based on these genealogical websites. And you eventually can really whittle down to like one person or three people or siblings, and then from there you investigate. So this genetic genealogy gives you the lead to investigate the people, but then you do another test with the old type of technology, the 20 marker. So it's a different technology that you're confirming the identity with quite often, because they already had that old type of testing on the Carla Walker case. So they already had that type of DNA profile. So when they got the swab from Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., they were able to confirm with the old technology. So what's great about the new technology is it still can be used with the old technology. And again, it's giving you a lead. And so I think that can also be very compelling to jury members, which is, to your point, a question, will they trust this new technology? And so I think it just only bolsters the case and gives those leads, and then you can confirm it later.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Have the Middlemans or other associates from Othram, have they testified at trials?
They have. And I think that is a whole other challenge that they faced is convincing people like, hey, we are scientists. We're trying to come into this not with a bias, but just truly testing what do the data show. They've had to practice making this information consumable to juries and compelling for juries, because I do think there are a lot of arguments that can be made around this technology. I think, for example, Brian Kohberger, from the Idaho college student murders, he tried to make the argument that they were basically going against his privacy by taking DNA from the crime scene. So there are all kinds of arguments that can be made against this new DNA technology that I don't think really stood. And obviously he's been convicted now. But there are all these kind of questions, just kind of often crap thrown at a wall of why we shouldn't trust this new DNA technology, or it hasn't been used in that many cases in the past, so there's no precedent for how it can be used. So it's very fragile, and it is really critical that people at Othram do testify and just kind of tell the truth, lay it out, so that the jury can ultimately decide. But to your earlier point, I think it is interesting how I do think DNA technology now is thought of differently than it was in the 90s, say. People get it, I think, better now. So I think there is hope for it. It is different technology, but it's also in a lot of ways better, or at least you're able to use it in new, different ways. And I think maybe people are more open to it than they used to be a number of years ago, which is a comforting thought, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when someone like Brian Kohberger is out there for, I don't know how long he was free before he was arrested. What was it? 6 weeks or something like that. Mm-hmm. But can you tell us about the journey of matching Brian Kohberger? How did that come about for Othram? And did they try like the state lab before they approached Othram?
We have done so many cases that I don't want to like say the wrong, spread misinformation. I don't recall whether other labs had been tested first, but I do know that they got a DNA sample from the knife sheath, from specifically the snap of the knife sheath that had been left in the bed with two of the victims at the crime scene. And because when you pull the snap, you like kind of interact with it in a more rough way than the rest of the sheath, they had more DNA there. They were able to test it. They whittled it down to that it was someone of Italian origin. They figured out that they were living in Pennsylvania or were from Pennsylvania, and had narrowed it down. And they were able to give them a name. I mean, in that case, again, they were able to take other evidence like his car that had been seen cruising around the scene, as well as other evidence that that indicated that he had committed the crime. And I think what's interesting too, this is kind of veering off of your exact question, but it is fascinating to me that, I mean, Brian Kohberger, he was studying criminology. He had surveyed criminals as part of a project on like how they went about their crimes. And I think even kind of like how they got away with crimes. So he was very careful. And when he later, drove across the country and was at his family's home in Pennsylvania when they finally arrested him. And police saw when he was there, he was taking out garbage with gloves on. I mean, he was being so careful not to leave his DNA. I can imagine when he went to that crime scene, he was very careful about not leaving DNA. And so this is somebody who's very aware of how to commit a crime. And yet even he was caught within a matter of weeks. And just think, if he was willing to kill those 4 innocent students, what other crimes he could have gone out and committed. But it's also like a PSA, like if you're considering committing a crime, don't. Because even if you're great at covering up your DNA, you're probably going to leave some DNA behind. I think that's, for me personally, part of the point of our podcast is like, hey, like you got to realize science is catching up with people. You don't want to commit these crimes. And in so doing, maybe will help prevent future crimes. One other piece of this, too, that I think was special about this case for Othram is quite often Othram's cases are cold cases that have just been sitting around. We have the DNA, but we don't have the answers. But it was exciting. I mean, solving this Kohberger case, that was in real time in a way that is unusual and is the way of the future. I think this kind of thing is just going to become typical and normal. And so these types of crimes are going to be solved. And even I think it was Kristen Middleman at Othram told me that she believes that for every cold case that currently exists that has DNA evidence associated with it, those cases could be solved within our lifetime. So this is such a cliche, but it feels like the future is here. And as a historic true crime fan, it's been so exciting to hear about how this technology really is impacting the face of investigations.
You being a historic true crime fan makes me wonder if there's a case that you've always been obsessed with that you want Othram to take on just for your own personal experience to see if they'll be able to give you some answers. Is there some old one or current one that you're just like, this is perfect?
Oh, gosh. It's hard to say off the top of my head because I literally constantly have so many cases bouncing around inside of my head. I'm sorry, I don't have a satisfying answer for this one. Because also part of it is you have to know that the DNA is there and that it's like the right type of DNA. Like, for example, in the Carla Walker case, it was kind of perfect as well in that, yes, there was very little of it, but it was also semen as opposed to like even touch DNA. Like to me, although touch DNA can be compelling as well, that shows something happened. It wasn't like the perpetrator gave Carla a hug. It was clearly the sexual assault was there. So it's a little complicated to know exactly how it's going to be used for each particular case. So I can't give you a good answer off the top of my head, but it is an exciting time.
It was a good answer, nonetheless. I appreciated it.
Yeah, it really is an exciting time. It's very, very interesting to watch all this unfold. But why can't all labs be like Othram?
I mean, they first of all created new technology that literally is able to handle that more degraded DNA. So I think this is actually a really important distinction that you bring up, that like not all labs are created equally. And I think that's something that Othram is trying to change even through legal ways, through wanting more laws to come out about how creating a standard for how labs handle, treat, and analyze DNA. Because basically, it's like if you had a doctor or in medicine, if they didn't have a standard for how things are done or how much training or the process that a doctor has to go through to treat a patient, it 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 does feel a little bit like the Wild West when it comes to labs. Now, obviously, it's not as wild as the Wild West, maybe, but it's like there aren't these laws in place to make sure that certain protocols are being followed. And so it's both the technology itself, but it's also the process. Again, how a specific set of steps they go through to evaluate how much DNA do we have? Is it degraded? In what ways is it degraded? How should we analyze it? Because I think there are even different ways they can analyze it. It's a big question, but basically there's not a standard for how different labs process and analyze the DNA. And so very simply, hopefully as time continues, that can be more standardized and the process can be streamlined and produce more regularly results that we can rely on. Or also not consume DNA unnecessarily, because sometimes you can do the test and you just don't get the results, as has occurred many times.
Yeah, I think it's incredible what they do, and I know they have their own database too at DNA Solves, and I know they've in the past invited folks to upload their, DNA sample or whatever they call that, the order of it, I guess, but to use their database as well. So yeah, they really come at it from both angles too. They have created their own database of users, which can only help them get closer with the forensic genetic genealogy stuff. My question to you is about the podcast. How many episodes is season 1? And then does season 1 have an ending, or is it, are you going to do a season 2? Yeah. What are the plans on the future of this podcast?
Well, we have a number of episodes out, but they're continuing to come out weekly. And we will have more than 20 episodes for our first season. I think there's still, funnily enough, some decisions being made on exactly which episodes are potentially being cut or revamped. So we're still in the thick of it. But yeah, more than 20 episodes, and we'll see what happens if we continue to have the show. And I think what's fun is that for some of the episodes we go in deep, like in the Carla Walker case, we have 4 full episodes on that. And other cases we have multi-part series, but then other cases we just do a quick episode on. So you get to hear about a lot of different cases and how this technology is being used, even for cases like there were remains of a skeleton found in the wall of someone's home. They had no idea when they were doing renovations, they found the skeleton of human remains. And they were like, we need to figure out what happened to this person. Is this a victim of a crime? And they found out that it was someone who had died many years ago, like in the 1800s. And so it was like the oldest case, I think, that where they've identified someone through this technology. So we tell the story of that case. We tell another story of the Candy Rogers case, where a very young girl went missing, and they found her shoes and her body in the woods, and they just had no idea who had done it. I mean, she was going around selling mints in her neighborhood. She just disappeared, and they couldn't figure out who it was until they used this technology 62 years later. And that's something that I think is powerful about a lot of these cold case stories, is that it's communities coming out of the woodwork, detectives who maybe even weren't even born when the crime occurred. And they care enough to say, I don't want to let this case fall through the cracks. I want to do something. And they work these cases and use this new technology, and suddenly we have a solution. And sometimes I won't give away exactly who did that one because I don't want to give every case away. But in that case, they had to ask someone's daughter because the alleged perpetrator had died. And so they had to go to the daughter and say, we think your father committed this crime. Will you give us your DNA? So it's also, will she give over her DNA? What a horrible thought. Oh my gosh, my dad, someone I loved and trusted, might have committed this horrible crime. So those are the kinds of cases we're getting into. And it's That was a long answer to your question, but we have a lot of cases, and I can't wait for people to be able to hear all these stories.
I can't wait to have you back on in however long, because the technology and the way Othram operates, again, accelerates at such a pace, and it never feels like they're going too fast. It always feels like when you question the new developments of their technology, they back it up with a ridiculous amount of data and peer review and more information that just like guarantees that they're on the right track. So even though it feels like it might be too fast, who knows? In 2 months, you might come on and say, I didn't even think that they were going to do this thing, but this has made it even better. So I can't wait for that to happen. Yeah.
It is exciting all the time how they're using the technology in new ways that is interesting and groundbreaking.
Yeah, and we saw them at CrimeCon this year in Denver, and they had a huge booth, and they were displaying how they've put AI to work for them and in their causes, and it was unbelievable. It was literally so fast for me to I couldn't understand what David was saying, because it was information going by too fast, but it was really impressive. But I do find that's kind of how it feels at first with this stuff, because I remember the first time we spoke with the Middlemans, and it's got to be back in 2020 probably. And I remember being like, is this guy serious? Like, this can't be real, because this is going to change
it sounds
crime.
Like magic. It literally
really
sounds
does.
like magic.
Yeah. And the way they both come across, which is like, you never I mean, you do say like, is this real? But their attitude is like so confident. It borders on like playful arrogance. You know what I mean? I say that in the best, best light. Like, it's almost daring you to trust what's going, like, question it, please. Like, I'm so confident about this. Question it, and I'll give you the answer, because I'm so confident. And that's how they came across.
Those questions. And it's so true, just from speaking with them and just kind of absorbing the world of Othram. They work so hard. Like, I think I work hard? No, they work so hard. You know, they live and breathe this stuff. And in a way, it's kind of like reassuring to know that, like, the scientists behind this, they are devoting their lives to this in an incredible way. It feels like they're obsessed. They're obsessed. So yeah. Well, that's great. That's what this industry needs, honestly, and they're incredible, and you're incredible, and thank you so much for you guys
speaking
are
with
incredible.
us, Caitlin.
The work you're doing is so important too.
Thanks.
So
well, yeah,
I appreciate
we just like to tell the stories. Yeah,
so important.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It's been so fun to have this conversation.